So yeah, I'll get straight into what I wanted to talk about, which was really just to cover a couple of projects that I think might be relevant that sort of talk about the concept of multimodal mapping, but maybe in a different way. And I thought I'd start just by talking about the traditional way that people have conceptualized, particularly when you work with computers, interaction. And that's the mode that I call computer as tool. So this is from a paper I wrote quite a long time ago when we were thinking about other ways to use computers apart from them just being tools. But this is a dominant paradigm and it's still very dominant today. And it's not that it's a bad paradigm or a wrong paradigm. It's just that there are other possibilities. But I think to introduce the other possibilities, you first have to understand this paradigm. And that's the idea where you have a person who's often, in the human computer interaction literature is referred to as a user, and that they have some intention. That intention is analyzed by the computer and then interpreted, and that is used to create something, which is the output that the computer produces. And this might be working continuously. So it might be the generation of sound, it might be the generation of imagery, or it might be something else. But there's this very definite flow between intention and output. And I guess you would think of that as a mapping, that interpretation. So once the information goes into the computer, there's a mapping between that user input and the output that's produced. So I'm just going to show you a project. This is not my project, but it's a project in our lab that I'm involved with. It's led by a percussionist and researcher, Alon Ilzar. It's called the ESTIX. And this is a prototype of one of the prototypes of the devices that we've been developing in our lab. And it's using this mapping, and mapping is really, really interesting to the researchers here because this device basically, it just measures gesture. It measures the acceleration, the orientation of the device in real time, and it transmits that over Bluetooth very quickly. And it's used for music creation. And as researchers, we're really interested in the traditional mappings, like how do we map a person's gestural movement to something that's musically meaningful. So I'll just play a quick video of Alon using this so you get a sense of how this device works and what it can do. So I think you get the idea there that there's an obvious mapping between the gestural motion and the sound that the device uses to output. And a lot of that is to do with energy. So the amount of energy that you put into the movement is a parameter that's mapped directly to the output. So it's using this very, as I said, traditional paradigm of computer as tool that's shown on the left here. But for many years, I've been really interested in a different kind of way of thinking about computers, and that's more akin to the biological concept of an ecosystem. And I'm not talking about biology as being the point of the simulation or anything like that. It's just purely metaphorical. So thinking about the computer as part of an ecosystem that includes the environment and the noise and other aspects that are in the physical environment itself. So we don't think of the person so much as a user anymore, but as a participant and a player or an organism, if you like, that's in that environment. So that's really what I'm going to talk about for the next couple of minutes and just show you a couple of different works that use this method or this kind of way of thinking about how we do interaction and how we do mapping in a way that's different than the tool environment. And the reason why I want to work this way is because I'm really interested in this concept of generative systems. So I won't go into a lot of detail about what they are. Maybe many of you have probably heard of them, but they have a series of properties, and I'll explain what these are in a minute. But just to summarize them, they generate complexity from what's known as bottom up. So rather than trying to make something complex from the beginning, you start with something simple, and that simple thing builds its own complexity. So in a sense, you're getting something for nothing. You're getting complexity for free. It's a systemic approach. So in an ontological sense, it prioritizes process over object. It exploits properties that are sort of ubiquitous in the universe, I guess, such as emergence, which is the generation of higher order properties from simpler primitives. And generally those higher order properties are more complex. And another principle of generative systems is this idea of database amplification, which I'll go into a little bit of detail in a second. And lastly, I think they're a really interesting perspective for what I would call creative discovery, so that people working in combination with these systems are able to discover new forms of creativity and creative behavior that they couldn't have done without them. So let me just quickly explain what I mean by database amplification, because this is kind of at the heart of a lot of what I'll be talking about. And some of the other principles will become apparent when I show you a couple of works in a minute. But the basic idea of database amplification is that you have a very simple specification of low complexity. So this could be something like a set of rules, a set of principles, a set of parameters. And through this generative process, and this doesn't have to be computational, it can be biological, it can be mechanical, it can be anything basically. But by using this specification of low complexity, the generative process uses a processual way of understanding that specification to generate a form, an artifact, or a behavior that has much higher orders of complexity. And if we're talking about computers, this complexity can be orders of magnitude, so tens, hundreds, thousands, millions, even billions of times more complex than the original specification. And if you're wondering what a common example of this is, it's us, it's DNA. So if you think about the way that all life on Earth comes to be generated, if you want to think of it in that way, it's from a specification that's encoded in the amino acids that make up our DNA. And that, if you think about that as a series of codes, if you like, so biologists use the letters A, T, G, C, and those base pairs basically encode through a whole complex series of molecular machinery the ability to build complex things like people, for example. So the first work I'm going to show you that uses these principles is called niche constructions, and I've been working on this for quite a few years on and off, but the basic idea is more than a decade old. I'll cut to the chase and just tell you what it is and how it works. It's a population of line drawing agents. Whoops, sorry, gone fast, too fast. It's a population of line drawing agents, and basically what they are software agents, if you like, software drawers. And all they do is draw on a canvas. They can just either deposit ink or not deposit ink. And they have 5 parameters that control all of their behavior. So they're listed here. I'll go through them quickly and then I'll show you what they do. So curvature is just how much they want to change their direction. There's a value called irrationality, which is the propensity to sort of wander from the fixed path that they're currently on. There's fecundity, which is their probability that they will give birth to children, which also draw lines. Mortality, which is the probability of dying, which means they'll stop drawing. And lastly, offset, which is where, when they have children, they'll place those children in relation to where they currently are on the canvas. And the canvas is just a flat 2D surface. There's only one rule in this system, and that's if an agent crosses another line. So if you're drawing and you happen to intersect with another line, you die. That's the end. And this is the entire system. So you can see the specification is very simple. It just consists of 5 parameters and a single rule. So to give you a sense of what these parameters do, this is probably the most interesting one. It's the irrationality gene. So all of the parameters just vary between 0 and 1, and a value of 0 means that the agent will just draw a straight line. As you increase the value of the irrationality, the line gets more kind of crazy and irrational. So you can see on the right there, when it's 1, it's just sort of moving around in very tight circles. Okay, so if you run this, you seed your blank canvas with a few of these agents and you just let them run, you get these drawings that are reasonably complex. And the genes themselves, the parameters, are just determined randomly at the beginning. And by randomly changing them, of course, you get drawings of different qualities and with different characteristics. But one thing that you do notice is that even though there's some complexity here, the complexity seems to be fairly uniform across the entire drawing. There's not a lot of change in density, for instance. In the drawing on the left, the agents were started in a random position. In the drawing on the right, they all started from the center and were facing outwards. So you can kind of see that dark bit in the center where they began. So what I wanted to do with this system was map the complexity in a different way than just the basic system's vocabulary had the capability of doing. And so in order to do that, I turned to this process, which is called niche construction, and it's a biological process. It's commonly observed in a lot of organisms on Earth, including humans. So it's widely discussed amongst biologists that human language is a product of niche construction. I'm not going to turn this into a biology lesson. If you're interested in this, you can Google it and you can find out all about it. A lot's been written about it. But basically, some examples are termites that build these nests that basically keep the internal temperature of their nest at a very constant temperature despite changes in the environment. Beavers, which build dams and so on. So the niche construction process is just simply creating an environment for a particular organism that is likely to result in the organism's offspring having a higher chance of survival. So organisms modify their environmental niches, creating or maintaining a heritable environment for their offspring. So we can apply that to this very simple line drawing system. And the way that we do that is just add one more parameter, an additional gene, which is a preference for a particular density. And then as the system is running, and you can see this in this diagram here, in a square area around where the agent is, we just measure the density and we map that measured density to the preference that the agent has. And that follows a sort of a bell curve. So if you're in the sweet spot, if the density is exactly what you want, you're going to be very happy. If the density is too dense or not dense enough, you're going to be unhappy. And eventually, if it gets too far off what you want, you're going to die because of that. And this very simple addition creates an incredible amount of variation and complexity. So in this video, it's just running in real time from the system. You can see it's very simple. There's a series of agents, and some of them have a higher density preference than others. So they end up basically drawing, the ones that have high density end up drawing lots of thick lines very close together. The ones that don't like the high density, but prefer a lower density, tend to carve off areas and have fewer offspring and create these areas of white space in order to preserve that preference for less density. So you can see that from this process, you get this much greater variation in the complexity of the drawings, and to my mind, they're much more interesting. They feel like they've got some kind of weird intention. And remember, this is just starting off from a blank canvas. There's nothing else apart from those 6 variables and that one rule that if you intersect with another line, you stop drawing, that creates these drawings of incredible complexity. So again, it's an example of this principle of database amplification, where we've got a very simple set of rules generating a huge amount of complexity. And just by changing the starting position of the agents and the number of agents, you get all this variation in the kinds of drawings that are possible. So it really feels like it's a huge parameter space of possibilities. And just through that simple mapping, being able to get a lot of complexity. And just to sort of tail end this part of the talk, we took the algorithm and put it into a real robot rather than a software simulation of a robot and got it to draw. And you get, kind of similar behavior. These are very large-scale drawings that were done for the ICHCAI conference. It's an artificial intelligence conference in 2015. So a couple of robots just sitting around measuring the density of the lines drawn underneath them and trying to alter the density based on preference. Okay, I'm going to take a little side diversion just momentarily to talk about feedback loops, because I think these are really interesting and part of this whole ecosystemic process. So just to talk about what I mean by feedback loops very quickly, again, I'm talking in a very general conceptual sense. You have some kind of process that has inputs going into the process and outputs coming out of that process. In the standard concept of feedback, you just take the outputs and put them into the inputs. So the classic example is if you have a microphone and a speaker, and you put the microphone close enough to the speaker, the sound from the speaker gets picked up by the microphone, and that gets fed back into the microphone, that goes back into the speaker, and so on, and you just get annoying feedback. If you make one simple change to that system and add some kind of variable function that transforms the output before feeding it back into the input, that can give rise to an incredible amount of complexity and change. So this one simple addition can result in a whole series of different ways of thinking about what feedback is capable of doing. Now, anyone who's old enough to remember Doctor Who, which maybe is nobody, will remember this. I'm just going to play this video really quickly. All they did was point a video camera at a screen and pointing the video camera at the screen created all this complexity. And you can still do this today. Particularly, it works well with analog video cameras. And of course, the whole series of artists who worked with video feedback going back to the 1950s, 1960s. And another classic example is iterated function systems, fractal systems, that basically just mathematical systems that feed back on themselves and generate this huge amount of complexity. Another great example from the 1940s is Ross Ashby's homeostat. This was an electromechanical device that basically had 4 units that were filled with magnetic fluid and fed back on themselves, and basically tried to maintain what was called homeostasis. So basically, there's perturbations put into the system, and the system feeds back on itself and tries to maintain a stable state. And Ashby believed this was the basis for how to build thinking analog machines. And indeed, it's been used by musicians, by computer scientists. It's a really interesting area. If you're interested, just Google, homeostat, and you'll find a whole lot of information about it. Another example of this feedback is in the book by Douglas Hofstadter that he wrote quite a while ago now, I Am a Strange Loop, and his long convoluted argument that consciousness was this constant feedback process as well. Brattenberg wrote this book in the 1980s called Experiments in Synthetic Psychology that used this very simple feedback process in early robotics to give them intelligence as well. With just 2 neurons, the robot was able to avoid obstacles and navigate through an environment. The really famous work by Alvin Lucia, I Am Sitting in a Room, for those of you who don't know this work, is basically he put himself in a room with a microphone and recited a short text on and recorded it onto tape, and then got the tape and played it back into the room, recorded it again, played it back into the room, recorded it again, played it back. Let's have a quick listen to the first, and I'll fast forward this video because it runs for 20 minutes.
I am sitting in a room different from the one you are in now. I am recording the sound of my speaking voice, and I am going to play it back into the room again and again.
A way to smooth out any irregularities my speech might have.
So you can see that after, many times, repeating this many times, the voice itself completely disappears and the resonances of the room become really prominent, and you get this whole sort of musical resonant performance emerging through this very simple feedback process. The last thing I want to show, and this is this great device, I don't know if anyone's used it before, called Cosmos Drifting Memory Stations, designed by Vlad Kramer from SensiLab. It's using this feedback principle, and it has, it's like basically an echo unit. It's for sound, for music, but it uses prime numbers rather than using metrical beat rhythms to do the feedback. And it's an amazing device to play with in terms of getting these really interesting feedback, using feedback systems in this way. Okay, next I wanted to talk about this work, Eden, which is quite old, but I think it's really relevant in terms of this idea of combining mapping and feedback together. It was inspired by some time I spent in a national park in the northern part of Australia. It's called Lidgefield National Park. So it's at the very top end of Australia. Just it's actually quite close to Indonesia in terms of the Australian mainland, and it's very remote, but extremely beautiful. These are just shots from a tourist brochure, but it has a whole lot of waterfalls and lagoons, but also it has these incredible termite mounts. And termites are a really interesting example of a simple organism that through emergent complexity can build structures that are very complex. So they maintain a homeostatic environment in terms of temperature, even though it gets very hot, 30 or 40 degrees in the summer. And at night it gets very cold. Inside the nest, the temperature is constant all the time. The size of the structure is thousands of times bigger than an individual termite, and yet collectively they're able to do this. And interestingly, they're able to do this without an architect, a central planner, a boss ant who's kind of organizing all the ants and telling them what to do. They just self-organize and are able to create these incredibly complex structures. So this was the inspiration for this work, which is basically a simulation of an ecosystem in 2D. And so in early 2000, I came back from this national park really excited because I'd spent 4 or 5 days there just camping and looking and watching and observing the nature around me. And it really inspired me to try and create a simulation of this. And I guess in a way you could think of this as a very contemporary version of a landscape painting, but rather than painting the landscape literally or even figuratively, I was painting with process rather than painting with paints or trying to visually replicate what I'd observed. I was trying to replicate what I'd observed in terms of processes. So the way that this system works is very simple. There are 3 kinds of entities in the world. There are agents, which are capable of learning and reproducing and making sound. There's what's called biomass, which you can think of as just like plants. And there are rocks, which are hard and which if you bump into them, they'll hurt you. You can't penetrate them, but you could also use them for shelter. And you can also use them for protection. So the world basically runs as a simulation, and the simulation works in real time. It takes about 15 minutes of real time on Earth for a year of simulation time to pass in this Eden world. And in the original version of the work, I just wrote it as a simulation that ran on the computer to see if I could get complex behaviour emerging in this ecosystem in a similar way to what I'd observed in the national park. I just wanted to spend one slide just talking very briefly about how the creatures, the agents, if you like, organisms, whatever you want to call them, work. They have a series of sensors, and they can sense the color of the cells around them. If there's nutritional value, they can hear sound at different frequencies that's close by. They can smell, they can introspect pain. So if another agent is hitting them, or if they've bumped into a rock, that pain sensor will basically light up. And they can also introspect energy. So basically energy is a measure of how healthy they are. If they don't have enough energy, they'll die. If they eat food, they'll get some energy. If they run around without eating food for too long, the energy will start to drop, and again, they'll die. Inside the agent, I guess conceptually, is a mapping. It's a really complicated mapping, and this mapping is dynamic, and it's learnt by the agent as it's interacting with the world around it. It uses a technique called extended classifier systems, which is a kind of machine learning system, a little bit different than neural networks, but still very capable of learning and adapting to environments. And through this learning system, it can decide what it wants to do. So the possibilities are quite simple. It can move forward, it can turn left or turn right. And of course, turning left constantly means just turning around in a circle. It can hit whatever's in front of it. It can mate with whatever's in front of it. It can try and eat with whatever's in front of it, or it can sing, which means make a sound at a particular frequency. Now, of course, choosing these actions can either be positive or negative, depending on what's in front of you. So if you try and eat some food that's in front of you, that's probably going to increase your energy. And the action or the set of rules or set of events that led to you doing that will result in positive reinforcement from the environment. So that rule will tend to get used more often. If you try and move forward into a rock, that's going to hurt you. So your pain sensor will rise and your energy will drop. And so the environment has given you negative feedback. So the rules that said to do that will diminish in terms of their likelihood to be used. So what happens is, over a long period of time, the agents learn how to exist in the world, and they learn how to find food, they learn how to mate with each other, they learn how to use sound in order to signal if a predator's coming, for example, or to call their offspring. And so these learned behaviours aren't programmed into the system, they're learnt by the system as it runs. So this eventually became an artwork, an installation work that was shown all around the world. And I've got this sort of schematic diagram here showing how it's presented before I'll actually show you the work in situ. So there were two screens that project the virtual world into the real world, and those screens are transparent. And this was done deliberately to try and blur the boundaries between this virtual space where these agents exist and the real space in which people are moving and interacting. And in order to hear what they're doing, there's 4 speakers around the screens, which basically spatialize the sound coming from each of the agents. So people in the space can hear what the agents are, the sounds that they're making. And the last important point is there's an infrared camera, which is mounted on the top, and that's just a machine vision system that can detect people, and that information is fed back to the computer. So it recognizes when a person is standing near the screen, and it tracks that person and looks at how long they're there and whereabouts within the installation space they are. And the last thing is there's a fog machine, which kind of makes it kind of misty and mysterious, but it also helps to blur the projection and make it seem three-dimensional, so that, again, the differentiation between the real environment and the virtual environment is diminished. So this is what it looks like with a person standing there. The environment itself is very abstract, but it's constantly changing and dynamic. It's just using this very simple visual representation of the agents, the food, and the rocks. And they're all based on this lattice grid that gets projected into the environment. So the important thing that I wanted to talk about with this work is the mappings. And these two mappings are really what makes the work, I guess. So the mappings are very simple. Basically, the presence of someone is mapped to the production of food. So the longer that you stay in the installation, the more likely food is to appear near where you are standing. And the reason for using this mapping was because of interest. If you visit an art museum and you go and see an artwork, the more interesting the work is, the longer you're likely to stay and look at the work. If the work is uninteresting, you're likely to leave because it's just not interesting. And this simple principle is used as basically a proxy for interest. So the virtual creatures in the environment have no direct knowledge of whether a human is present or not. But what they do know is that sometimes food is more plentiful than others. And over time, they learn that by making interesting sounds, they can keep people in the space for longer, hence increase their production of food. And so that allows them to live for longer and to survive and reproduce. The second mapping is that people's movement maps to the mutation rates. So these creatures are breeding and living and dying over short periods of time. And so the more that people move around, the more restless they are. So the more that they're sort of looking for something interesting. So that promotes change in the creature's behavior. So basically the mutation rates, their learning mutation rates, increase if people are moving around. If they're still, you're probably sitting, listening and enjoying what's happening. So you don't want the sound or the behavior to change too much. Whereas if you're moving around to find something new, you want the behavior to change. So these two simple mappings led to a whole series of really interesting outcomes in terms of how the work works. I've got a video here. I'll play it in a second, but I'll just describe very briefly what's happening. So this was shot in a gallery in Melbourne, and it was a very busy day. So a lot of people had been in. So you can see that there's a lot of food. And so all the creatures are kind of content because there's lots of food there. But everyone is outside the sensing area of the camera, and except for a little boy who starts running around. So the food starts to run out, and you'll hear the creatures making all these sounds, basically trying to call people back into the installation space. And the little boy runs around. Eventually, he gets his dad to come in too. So I'll just play the video, and all the sounds that you're hearing are generated in real time by the creatures. And these are sounds, or the sequence of sounds is what they've learnt to make after 2 weeks of this being in the gallery, and being able to kind of basically learn that by making these interesting sounds, people are likely to stay for longer. So I guess just to talk very briefly, and then I'll finish, about what's interesting about this is that none of those behaviours were programmed into the system. The system itself learnt those behaviours. So in my earlier slide, I mentioned creative discovery. That's an example of creative discovery, that the behaviour of the system was not something explicitly programmed into it. It was behaviour that emerged through the synergetic interaction between humans and virtual creatures, between human and machine. And that's why I think these systems are so interesting and so exciting, because they can provide you with something that's beyond your capability as an artist or designer to actually conceptualize directly or to program directly. So that's it for my talk. I'm really happy to answer questions. If you're after more information, I have a website that's got lots of other examples of works that I've done, including the works that I've talked about. And I'd be really happy to answer any questions. So thank you.